Consent versus sex trafficking, party lifestyle versus felony, rapper versus criminal boss. Two competing narratives were presented to the jury before they began deliberations in the Sean Diddy Combs federal sex crimes trial. We are breaking down the highlights of the prosecution and the defense closing arguments as we await the highly anticipated verdict in a trial followed around the world. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. At the time of this recording, the jury in Sean Diddy Combs' criminal trial is about to be handed over the case, believe it or not. Wow. They're ultimately going to determine whether or not Diddy is guilty of 1 count of racketeering conspiracy, 2 counts of sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, and 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. Let me also just say, I know my voice is off. I had a wedding this weekend. I know I go to a wedding before deliberations, potential verdict this week. I know I kind of lost my voice. Anyway, what's happening? So, aside from jury instructions, the actual law that they will follow in this case that was explained to them by the judge, the last thing that they heard in this case were closing arguments. And I say this all the time, how important closing arguments are. The last attempt by each side to persuade the jury as to whether or not a defendant is guilty or not guilty, right? The last attempt to summarize all the evidence and testimony in a case in a compelling narrative. It's the last chance to convince the jurors. But here, in a complicated case like this, with so many charges and so many elements, closing arguments in this case were especially important. Think about the amount of testimony and the amount of evidence that the jurors were presented and have to comb through. How did they make sense of it all? And we heard from both the prosecution and the defense. And I have to believe that as the jurors go back to deliberate Diddy's fate, they will not only consider all that was presented to them over the course of a nearly 7-week trial, but also the closing arguments. They may be guided by what the prosecution and the defense argued about the evidence and testimony. So we figured it's probably good to highlight some of the major key points from both the prosecution and the defense's closing arguments, maybe even wins by the prosecution and the defense in their closing arguments. And I say we, because I'm not doing this alone. I want to bring on somebody who was there for every day of testimony in this case, and she was certainly there for the closing argument. Somebody who knows the ins and outs of this case, Law&Crime's in-court reporter, Elizabeth Millner, or as everybody online likes to call her now, Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth is here for everybody. Elizabeth, good to see you.
Good to see you too, Jesse.
So, I'm going to start with the prosecution, and then we'll talk about the defense, and then we'll talk about the rebuttal prosecution closing. First up, we had AUSA, Assistant United States Attorney Christy Slavic, delivered the prosecution's closing argument. And what stood out to me, and I thought this was critical, is Slavic said that at the heart of sex trafficking, right, the heart of the sex trafficking counts, and also by extension the racketeering conspiracy, because remember, that whole charge is built upon the idea that Sean Combs operated a criminal enterprise that was built upon a pattern of abuse of women. And one of the underlying predicate crimes of this criminal association, this criminal enterprise, is sex trafficking. So sex trafficking is the heart of it. She said something very critical. She said, quote, "We're not asking you to find that every single freak-off or every single hotel night was sex trafficking. Cassie and Jane both have long relationships with the defendant that have ups and downs. They both told you that they were willing to try freak-offs at the beginning and were open to possibly doing them again. And even though they both repeatedly testified about not wanting to have freak-offs, there may have been some instances where the elements of sex trafficking aren't met. But to convict the defendant of sex trafficking, you do not need to find that all of the freak-offs or even the majority of the freak-offs that he had with Cassie or Jane were the product of force, fraud, or coercion. As I expect the judge will instruct you, you only need to find that the elements of sex trafficking are met on one occasion during the period charged in the indictment." By the way, you know how there's no cameras allowed in the courtroom, there's no recording devices allowed? It's frustrating, to say the least, because how great would it have been to have something like Claude Nopin in the courtroom with us, right? This tiny wearable AI-powered device completely changes the game. So I wear mine as a wristband. You can also clip it on, pin, maybe hang it like a necklace. I'll tell you what, during law school, early in my legal career, I really could have used something like this. Even now, as a host, it's a total cheat code, whether it's meetings, interviews, quick brainstorms. The NotePin catches everything. It transcribes in 112 languages. It automatically tags speakers, and it drops everything into this clean, digestible summary. There's no more messy notes. There's no more lost ideas. It's not just a recorder, by the way. It actually acts like a hands-free assistant, pulling insights, organizing information, and letting you stay fully in the moment of a conversation. If you want to make the most of your time, it's time to try the Claude NotePin right now. And right now, you can get 10% off. Just click the link below or scan the QR code on screen. She went on to say, quote, "You don't have to find that all force, threats of force, coercion, or fraud were used. It can be any of these illegal means alone, and it can be any of these illegal means in combination." And this is an obvious point, but the fact that a victim consents once to a commercial sex act, that doesn't mean that she consented every time. You only need to find that one of these hotel nights, or freak-offs, right, meets the elements of sex trafficking here. So Elizabeth, she really doubled down on that. That was her getting in front of the times when it appeared that Jane and Cassie consented, but also clarifying what this case is about, right? You just need to find that one time. That was important, right?
Yeah, that was definitely really important, Jesse. And it was something that was surprising to me because if you think back to just the summary witnesses and the flight summary charts, according to the government, there are several alleged instances of sex trafficking. But again, to your point, Jesse, Christy Slavic really kind of telling the jury you really only need to find one instance of sex trafficking to find the defendant guilty. But as it pertains to Jane, Christy Slavic really kind of took it piece by piece by piece, kind of really laying out the different stages of how this turned out to be kind of alleged sex trafficking. And so the first stage was the drugs, the outfits, putting pornography on together. The second stage being the fantasy talk, and that was the fantasy talk as it comes to Sean Combs fantasizing about Jane doing things with other men in front of him. And so Christy Slavic even said during her closing argument that Jane thought it was going to be just this one-time thing, that it was going to be the first hotel night, that would be it. But then it just kind of set forth their entire relationship, and that within a few months of just doing these hotel nights, she wanted them to stop. But even the third stage, she had pointed out, was using payments of Jane's rent as leverage. And so there were just several instances of sex trafficking that they particularly talked about. And again, that being the prosecution, where they point to specific instances such as the sobriety party that happened in October of 2023, where Jane tried to go do a hotel night without using drugs. And then she ended up throwing up between escort number 2 and escort number 3. And then, of course, one of the big things that the prosecution really talked about was a clear point of sex trafficking in their eyes was what had happened on June 18th, June 19th of 2024. So just last year, or it's just been a year now, but in terms of when Sean Combs was over at Jane's residence, there was a physical altercation, and then she was allegedly forced to do a hotel night at her home with another escort. And this was after she was beaten, after she was kicked and dragged, and other instances. And so as far as it comes to count 4, those were just the big points that the prosecution alleged were sex trafficking. Obviously, there was a lot more that they wanted to talk about, but in terms of just even kind of the sexually explicit videos of the hotel nights / the freak-offs, the Wild King nights, whatever you want to call them, I remember there was a point kind of as we were wrapping up the case overall that the defense was really kind of showing the jury these sexually explicit videos. However, the prosecution is saying that Jane might have been on this liquid Molly, and or / MDMA that was kind of liquefied, or it was mixed in with water, and then it was like kind of squirted into her mouth, and that's why she may have sounded enthusiastic, or it might have appeared that she was consensual in these particular sexually explicit videos. But again, the government kind of pointing out that this was a clear instance of Jane being under the influence of drugs, and maybe that's why she appeared to be consenting or enthusiastic as far as just her demeanor on these sexually explicit videos that, of course, we in the gallery didn't see. Only the jury has seen it, and the parties and the witness and the defendant, of course.
And there was a number of text messages from Jane where she is showing her reluctance to engaging in this, whether she was upset, she was jealous, whether she was upset how she was being treated. It was clear from messages that she took issue with these nights. And look, with Cassie, if you talk about whether or not there are clear-cut examples more than any others of sex trafficking, I've said it before, I'll say it again, the 2016 Intercontinental Hotel attack video, right? Because she claims that she was leaving a freak-off. Maybe it hadn't been completed, but then there was a sex worker in the room. She's being dragged back in the direction of the room. I think that can hit and check a lot of the elements of sex trafficking. Also checking a lot of the sex trafficking elements are the allegation when she was on an airplane with Sean Combs. He sits next to her, shows her sex tapes. She feels he threatens to release them. That's a form of a threat, form of intimidation. There's a travel component. They land. He demands a freak off. He gets a freak off. That also checks a lot of the boxes. And by the way, they also use forensic psychologist Dr. Dawn Hughes' explanations, right, throughout the closing argument to explain some of the behavior of Jane and Cassie, right? That was very strategic.
Yeah, and I think it made a lot of sense because Dr. Donhue's testimony, kind of similar to Cassie's, was so early on in the case that I think it was a good reminder for the jury to hear, why didn't she leave? Well, it's because Dr. Donhue's testified that, of course, a lot of abuse victims don't necessarily leave their partners right away because they want to go back to remembering the times where everything was good and they were in love, and that a lot of victims normally do that. And I think that's the big question, is why don't these victims leave? And I think Dr. Donhue's did a great job explaining that. And I think Christy Slavic also did a great job in really kind of sprinkling in little pieces here and there of Dr. Donhue's testimony in terms of why these women didn't leave, why they continue to stay, why they felt obligated to do these kind of sexually explicit acts, these sexual acts during these freak offs or hotel nights and that sort. But I think it was really great that she really went back to the forensic psychologist and really kind of put together maybe just the pieces or the parts that maybe people were kind of wondering in their head as in terms of why. And so she did a great job really kind of sprinkling in here and there why that may have happened.
Going to the racketeering conspiracy charge, arguably the most complex charge, the top charge, carries life in prison. When you heard Prosecutor Slavic talking about this and why they believe they have proven that there is in fact a criminal enterprise, this association of Combs' inner circle, that they all had to serve the common purpose, which was to protect him, to serve him, that they all agreed to commit underlying predicate crimes like drug distribution, kidnapping, bribery, arson. What stood out to you as some of the best arguments for why, in fact, there was an enterprise, why there was a criminal agreement?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it kind of stood out to me. And the way that the government was really kind of explaining how they've kind of met their case in terms of all the predicate acts, including drug distribution, kidnapping, arson, bribery, sex trafficking, forced labor, witness tampering, interstate transportation for prostitution. I feel like each and every single point of those predicate acts, they really kind of explain why the defendant might be found guilty on these. But I think the ones that kind of stood out to me was obviously drug distribution. And I say drug distribution mainly because every single witness who had testify in terms of the assistants, in terms of Jane, in terms of Cassie, they really kind of talked about drugs, and you're kind of thinking to yourself, okay, these are low amounts of drugs if you kind of think about it, but it doesn't matter. According to the prosecution, they say that drug distribution counts as delivering, passing on drugs as distribution, and they say it's a special ingredient for freak-offs, and some of the participants of kind of the alleged drug distribution were people like D-Rock, people like Kaye or Christina Coram, people like Fahim Muhammad. And AUSA Christy Slavic said that the first element of this is that the co-conspirator distributed the drugs. The second element being that the co-conspirator distributed the drugs knowingly. So they pointed to different drugs that have been testified about, like cocaine, meth, ketamine, oxycodone, Xanax, MDMA, GHB, 2C, and then mushrooms too. But in terms of just even distributing drugs to others, that they brought exhibits up, like exhibits including text messages from Brendan Paul to Fahim, where Brendan Paul had wrote in a particular text message, KK is aware $780 for personal Gucci items. What do we know about personal Gucci items? That they normally included drugs that were found in a Gucci bag that was normally close or on Diddy's person at all times for the most part. And then in terms of just other exhibits between text message chains between Guido and Fahim. Guido was an alleged drug dealer that was often used, and Fahim was one of Diddy's personal security guards, where the text message said, hey there, Puff has a balance of $450. So I think kind of proving that element, even in terms of just the Combs enterprise agreeing to distribute drugs, where there were messages from D-Rock where D-Rock had said, he sent a text where he said, I need some for bro being Sean Combs, and then the sum being, drugs. And then Christina Coram too. The prosecution really kind of pointed out that Christina Coram knew that Jane was taking drugs while she was doing these hotel nights, because there was one point in one instance that they pointed out where Jane was kind of convulsing on the beach from sand after kind of a really intense drug effect, and that Christina Coram was really aware of this, and that she kind of helped Jane while she was kind of having this reaction out on the beach, out on the sand. But I think another big point, Jesse, that really stood out to me is obviously kidnapping, and the government pointed to three different different instances of kidnapping. One being January of 2009, where Cassie's face was stomped on and she was held at a hotel, allegedly against her will, where Sean Combs got jealous because she was talking to a producer, and then Cassie drunkenly punched Sean Combs in the face, that he assaulted her very brutally, and that he forced her to stay in a hotel for a week, and that people like Roger Bonds, who was Diddy's then security guard, wouldn't let her leave. She wanted to go home to her mom, but she was unable to. She was pretty much trapped in this hotel during this particular instance. Then they bring it to a few years earlier here in New York City in 2004, where Capricorn Clark was forced to take a lie detector test for days on days on days after some jewelry went missing. And of course, the December of 2011, I should say, where Capricorn Clark was taken by gunpoint over to Kid Cudi's home. The government kind of pointing to those being clear instances of kidnapping too. And so if you think about that in context, that's two predicate acts right there if the jury kind of comes to that conclusion too. But there were other instances that I think they did a great job really kind of spelling out different examples of why the defendant might have been found guilty on these different kind of acts.
Yeah, no, and you're right. They only need to find two underlying predicate acts. So yes, was there a criminal conspiracy? Was there a criminal agreement? Was there a criminal enterprise? And were there two underlying predicate acts that they agreed to commit? So you laid out drug distribution, you laid out kidnapping. We didn't even get into Eddie Garcia and the hotel tape and bribery, the $100,000 that was allegedly paid to make sure that that tape never saw the light of day. And I agree with you, the argument that all of the assistants, or a majority of the assistants, or at least Christina Quorum, knew what was going on and knew what was going on behind closed doors and everybody was on the same page. I think that's key. Now, you talk about the underlying predicate crimes. One of them, my understanding at least, is also an independent charge, transportation to engage in prostitution. Those are two charges that he faces, but I believe they're also part of the racketeering. So I will tell you, I think this is the strongest series of charges they have against Diddy, carries up to 10 years in prison. I thought it was important for the prosecutor to say, hey, you don't need force or fraud or coercion. They could all consent. It's still a crime. Really focusing what on, Elizabeth? The trail of money, the Amex statements, Combs' texts, his voice notes, his team arranging, right? Really putting him at the center of transporting men and Cassie and Jane for the purposes of sex work.
And to your point, Jesse, I think also the government had to really kind of explain that just because these entertainers or these escorts don't necessarily call themselves prostitutes, that these still are acts of prostitution, whether or not they're calling themselves prostitutes or sex workers or not. And so in terms of count 3 and 5, again, that being transportation to engage in prostitution, I kind of go back to the flight summary charts where the government had a whole long list in chart form of just the different flights that were taken out, the money that was spent, and who was the account holder kind of behind it either being Sean Combs or it being Jane, who would purchase entertainers' flights out. However, she would be reimbursed by Sean Combs. And so there was one particular example. It was from August 26th of 2009, where Sean Combs coordinated with Jules, and Jules notably was the escort inside the hotel room during the March 2016 incident at the Intercontinental Hotel. But just that in this particular one, going back to August of 2009, that Sean Combs was coordinating with Jules to get him to New York City. So the jury was able to see flight records that a flight was $419.61, and then it also included a limo service for $220. And there were even points where Sean Combs had texted Jules he'll tip him more if he can make it to New York City because Jules is from LA. So there we go, transporting him from Los Angeles, California, all the way to New York City. And so the government also pointing out that the defendant paid for other escorts like Clayton Howard, aka Dave, to fly him from New York City to Los Angeles. And again, showing those flight summary charts where all the records are really kind of laid out there. There were text messages, including from Sean Combs to Bridget when he was in a relationship with Jane, where he was texting Bridget from Cowboys for Angels, so no longer Garen. It was Bridget who was kind of the point of contact, where Sean Combs is saying that he didn't want one particular escort to feel tired because he was traveling from Vegas to Los Angeles, and he sent a text message saying, LOL, damn, we don't want a tired situation, feel me. And then Bridget responded, Reggie is never tired, because that was the particular entertainer or escort that they planned on flying out to Los Angeles. And then the government pointing out that Cabral was also someone that was used quite often. He's from Atlanta. However, he was flown to New York City. And so there were just different points. And I think they made a lot of a lot of strong messages that were used kind of against Sean Combs in a way, like one particular audio message that said, I want the most wild king sex room in Vegas. And then Christina had responded, will Paul be there? So again, kind of pointing to the alleged co-conspirators being in the know of who was going to be there, what type of escorts were going to be used. And of course, Paul was one that was used often, going back to Cassie's relationship with Sean Combs and to Jane's relationship. And so kind of towards the end, the government was like, even KK facilitated the travel for escorts too.
Again, I think that those are pretty straightforward, but we'll see. And let's talk about the defense now. The defense's closing argument. Okay, so this was delivered by Mark Agnifilo, the lead counsel in this case. And I will tell you one of the parts that stood out to me, really jumping on the idea. Okay, so the prosecution's agreeing not every sexual episode of Cassie or Jane is sex trafficking. Mark Agnifilo says, if we're at freak-off number 75, and 75 of them have been consensual, what would have to happen if freak-off 76 to say, now it's sex trafficking? Really focusing on that jump, right? Like, now that's a federal crime? I think that's a good point. It gives the jury pause, no? Aside from all of the text messages from the alleged victims where they express their love for Sean Combs, they stay in touch with him, they're setting up these sexual events. It does become a point, you know, we're supposed to say everything was consensual and then it's sex trafficking. Was that a standout moment to you?
Yeah, it was a lot of standout moments from the defense's closing argument, right? So, for example, Mark Agnifilo, by the way, everyone, when you're seeing him in action giving the closing argument for the defense, it's very opposite from the prosecution, where he is just really animated. He's going back and forth, walking back and forth. Sometimes there were points he was away from the microphone, so you could barely hear him. He's using poster boards. He's using paper forms of text exhibits, really kind of putting on a lot of demonstratives. But right off the bat, he was saying this trial is a tale of two trials. First trial is the witnesses, the videos, the text messages, the evidence. And the second trial is just what is being told to the jury by the prosecution. And so Mark Agnifilo saying right off the top that this case is badly exaggerated. It's made up, in other words. Those were literally the words he used. And then when he was talking about drugs, he said it's personal use drugs, nothing else. He says that the evidence shows that it's swingers and threesomes. But I think one big thing, Jesse, is that I think really from the defense's perspective, they were really kind of driving the point that, yes, Sean Combs has done bad things, right? But they say, is it sex trafficking? So, for example, really kind of pointing to that they think it's a domestic violence issue. That's really the issue, especially when it comes to count two, that being related to Cassie. But one thing I noted during his defense closing is that he brought the CNN video up, and he was kind of talking about a particular Instagram post that Cassandra Ventura Fine had made after this video was released and after she got an outpouring of support, where she had said that domestic violence is the issue. So the defense really kind of using her words against her, where they were like, okay, well, she didn't say sex trafficking was the heart of the issue. She didn't say that this was the heart of the issue. She specifically said that domestic violence is the issue. And so the defense said that Cassie could have said sex trafficking. She could have said coercion and running away from freak-offs was the issue. But Mark Agnifilo told the jury that, again, Cassie believed it to be domestic violence. And so the defense saying that they weren't going to be putting up a bunch of charts and text messages, etc. But I think we're kind of trying to drive the point too that Cassie Ventura and Sean Combs were in a loving relationship, and at points it was toxic, something that's kind of been a theme throughout their cross-examination too of particular witnesses. And then even as it came to Jane and just kind of the allegations Jane has made, the defense really kind of pointing out that Jane is still getting her rent paid for by Sean Combs, that he had kind of helped her when she was going through like a bad child support type of situation, that her child's father wasn't pulling his weight in terms of just the money that he was giving to her and their child together, and that it was Sean Combs who stepped up. He was the one who provided the roof over their head. He was the one that continues to pay for her rent, even to this day, but also for her lawyer even to this day too. And I think what also is interesting, Jesse, is in my mind, I'm wondering, does the jury kind of want to know why didn't the defense put up any type of witnesses? Because in terms of just them going back and kind of using, I guess, the witnesses' words against them in a type of way, that these were all, again, government witnesses. These aren't defense witnesses or anything like that, because as we know, the defense didn't put up any witnesses. So I wonder, does that kind of go through their head as they're listening to all of this? Because it really was kind of going back and forth between mainly Cassie and Jane for the most part.
It might. On the other hand, they could say, no, the defense thoroughly cross-examined these witnesses, confronted them about problematic texts and Instagram posts or social media posts and alleged actions and staying with him. I mean, they really focused on the idea that these alleged victims could leave, and they eventually did leave, and then nothing happened to them. That's what, the defense's argument. So they might say, The defense said this is all about money. They were all out for something. They were never sex trafficked victims. It'll be curious to see what the jury thinks. And, the defense has said this is all about domestic violence. It's about love. It's about jealousy. It's not a federal crime. Real quick, because I know you have to jump in, I want to ask you a couple more things. So Agnifilo also hit upon, I think, one of the arguably weaker points of the case, right? Racketeering conspiracy. He was saying what? That Sean Combs is the only one charged here. There was no one testified that was part of a criminal enterprise. There's no evidence, anyone that was a co-conspirator, including Christina Coram, his former chief of staff. Did you feel that that was a key moment, really striking at the heart of racketeering conspiracy? There's no criminal agreement. There's no criminal enterprise?
Right. I think it definitely is, because even Mark Agnifilo was saying things along the lines of, other celebrities, they use their assistants to go get them stuff. They're not celebrities who just walk into CVS. In terms of the security, even the security all has firearms because they are security guards. They're professional guards. They have the license to carry, all of those things. And even just kind of bringing back just the HSI raids where Mark Agnifilo is kind of like, well, the guns just miraculously were all just, they were all brought out. No one knew where they came from. They could have been under the children's bed. All of that stuff. But in terms of just the RICO conspiracy and some of the alleged co-conspirators, Mark Agnifilo said that everyone needs a KK, that KK was somebody who was always Sean Combs' right-handed woman, that type of thing. And I will say, when Mark Agnifilo said that everyone needs a KK, I did see Sean Combs over at the defense table kind of nodding his head along. But Mark Agnifilo saying that he's not charged with racketeering, but racketeering conspiracy. And he points out that the government never called a co-conspirator to the witness stand. So the defense kind of even pointing out the particular incident with Cassie and Carrie Morgan, both who had testified during this trial, but about the hammer incident where Sean Combs had allegedly come over to, I believe it was either Cassie's apartment with a hammer, and that he was kind of threatening her. But the defense was pointing out that during this time, Cassie and Carrie Morgan, they didn't call police to turn in Sean Combs. What they ended up doing was calling Christina Coram and D-Rock. And then Mark Agnifilo said, did anyone say that KK or D-Rock was a co-conspirator? He said that the government is making it sinister, that he has personal security, and says that Agnifilo also pointed out that Sean Combs isn't charged with firearms, just as an outright charge. And so in terms of just... but even in terms of just Cassie's allegation, where she said she was made to carry firearms for Sean Combs, Mark Agnifilo pointed out it was the security guard who actually gave Cassie Ventura the firearm that she had to go into, I guess, the club with, that type of thing. So really kind of saying that this isn't an enterprise, that this isn't a criminal enterprise, I should say, but that these are just people who are working for Sean Combs, who's a high-powered celebrity, that he wants his privacy, that he wants his personal time, and he should be entitled to that because this isn't a criminal act.
Raising reasonable doubt. That's what they were trying to do, and we're kind of summarizing and condensing it here. And real quick, the prosecution had a rebuttal delivered by the prosecutor, Maureen Comey, in this case, the lead prosecutor, I believe. And remember, it makes sense because this is the prosecution's case. They have to prove the charges beyond reasonable doubt. Makes sense that they get the last word. Real quick, Elizabeth, these are the things that stood out to me. One, where she highlighted, so the defense's theory is that Cassie wanted to be urinated on, that Jane wanted to have sex with a man after being beaten, that Mia wanted to be sexually assaulted, that Cassie and Jane wanted to spend days in oil with UTIs and high heels. They were strange men, basically saying Agnifilo is tossing up excuse after excuse. And also there was this other part where they basically say that these women didn't have any financial incentive to testify, right? So the idea is Cassie had already settled her lawsuit. So what is she's risking perjury in a federal trial? Mia had already settled in mediation. There's no reason for them to come forward and put on what I think she said was a show for you. Those were the two biggest points in rebuttal to me. I know you have to jump out real quick, but if you wanted 30 seconds just to respond.
Yeah, of course. And so from the prosecution rebuttal, even things like Maureen Comey saying the defense put a whole lot of energy into blaming the victims and the United States government, and pretty much kind of bringing home the point that in Sean Combs' world, he couldn't take no for an answer. So really, even at the end, Jesse, where Maureen Comey is like, the defendant thinks that he's above the law. He beat Cassie. He raped Mia. He bribed security to cover it up. In his mind, he thought he was untouchable. Who stands up to a god? He didn't think that the women would even stand opened up to him. And so even Maureen Comey, I think her final words were saying that the defendant is not a god, he's a person, he stands equal in the law, find him guilty. So I really think kind of driving home those points of just different instances in terms of payment for sex, racketeering conspiracy, the kidnapping of Capricorn Clark in 2011, the points of Cassie, Mia, Jane, Kid Cudi, I think really kind of bringing home those points. And to your point also, Jesse, about the prosecution saying that the victims don't have anything at stake anymore, that Cassie did get her settlement, that Mia did settle years prior to this, and that Jane has no intention on filing a lawsuit, that she doesn't even have a lawsuit kind of, filed at this point anyway either. And so I think the prosecution, especially since they had the final word and the final message to the jury, was really kind of bringing back maybe any seeds of doubt that the jury may have had after listening to the defense's closing argument, and really trying to kind of prove their case in that final message, so that way the government can say that he is guilty on all of the charges.
All right, we'll see. It's going to be in the jury's hands. Elizabeth Millner, thank you so much for the great reporting as always. And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.